I'm Craig O'Donnell from Glasgow as well.
Right. Well, I think with that, we'll leave you to an introduction.
Right. Well, 6 months ago, just over, a group of us met here who had got some connection with Labri over the years and wanted to see if there was anything we could do to help ourselves in carrying on our Christian commitment, and particularly the aspect of it that's been touched in various ways by the Labri Fellowship and Francis Schaeffer's work and those who have followed on from his work. And one of the ideas we had was to invite somebody from the Labri people to actually come and speak to us. And so we're delighted to be able to have Ranald Macaulay and Susan Macaulay to speak to us today. Susan is actually one of Francis Schaeffer's daughters, the second daughter, if I'm right, yes, and therefore is sort of as deeply entrenched in the whole thing as anybody is. Ranald met Susan in Cambridge, was that right?
Oxford.
In Oxford, actually. But anyway, Ranald was the person who started up the English branch of Labri in Hampshire at Gresham in 1971, and then was previously involved in the Ealing part of it in the years before that, and then moved to Cambridge in 1996. His background originally studied law and then theology, and he has quite a phenomenal range of experience with all sorts of people, things, and everything else that's come through Labri over the years. And he will first introduce a bit about Labri itself, and then after a short break he'll be giving a talk entitled
Where have we come from, where are we going?
So without more ado, over to you.
Well, there could hardly be a more beautiful place to come in Scotland, would you not all agree with me? And hardly a more hospitable welcome. So thank you, Paul and Heather and Donald and Anne, who met us and brought us over last night. We ran foul of the terrible traffic coming over the Forth, but no matter. We'll doubtless return to that in the course of the day, as you see where I'm going. However, as I thought about today, I thought we would, as the whole purpose of our time together is in a way to reflect, having had an experience of Labri. Annalise was just saying that she had read most of the books over the years, going right back to the 60s when they started to come out. And in my conversations with some of you, just waiting as we came in, it's been very striking to see the influence that Labri had in some of your lives. John was telling me how he went out at the age of 21 and used to have long conversations with Os Guinness in Les Malaise, and so on. So thinking about that, I thought it would be valuable, and you'll see it will tie in to the theme of what I want to say, and I'm sure also to what Susan wants to say this afternoon, with a fairly extended introduction and a time of question and answers about Labri. Now, we don't normally do this, let me quickly say. We don't draw attention to Labri, so when we go and speak in various places, we just start in with whatever the subject is. And one of the things, as you know, those of you who've been to Labri and followed its writings through the years, is that we're a sort of an anonymous work. We don't advertise in any way, we're not trying to build anything big. And so I do it quite unashamedly to an audience like you who know about Labri in that way. So I thought it would be interesting for you and also helpful to the whole of our day together. Now, when the Schaeffers began in 1955, they moved from Champery to Alais, and they moved over to the canton of Vaud, to the little village called Huemo, where Labri began, Chalet Les Malaise. And it just struck me that it's almost a half a century. Now, exactly a half a century ago, and this is my point, exactly a half a century ago, they were going through a very dark time. And those of you who've read the Labri story will know some of the elements that made that up. For example, Frankie, Susan's younger brother, the youngest of the 4 children, contracted polio on the way back from the States when they were coming back from a furlough that they were having in the States. And they weren't quite sure what they were going to be doing in Switzerland. It was already quite a big big step for them to come back. And the mission that they were connected with weren't all that happy with some of the aspects of what Schaeffer had been saying. Incidentally, he had been going around lecturing on the subject true spirituality. Now note, this is before Labri. Labri began in 1955, and I'm speaking about the years subsequent to about 1949. And then, of course, Susan contracted rheumatic fever and had a long period of ill health, was basically bedridden for 2 years, in which she taught herself Braille, amongst other things, and self-taught her. You know, she did a Calvert. What did you do? Calvert. You did Calvert School correspondence and so on. So the image that people have of Labri is, I think, very romantic in some respects. You know, they see the completed article as it appears in the book. But in actual fact, and here's my point, I'm emphasizing this, in those years from about 1950, they were very dark years. And Schaeffer himself was pacing up and down, which he describes in the very beginning of the book, True Spirituality, pacing up and down inside the big loft, the hay loft, in the chalet which they had rented in Champéry, really going back to the basics of his own faith. So it was a very dark period like that. Now, what actually was going on was that they were learning the lessons in those dark days that were, in God's providence, able to become the fruitfulness of Labri. And I think there's something very important in that for us as Labri and also for us all. And I think they struggled with 3 areas which they came to a measure of reality in then, and which I think are the great contribution of Labri and a very, very important aspect of what we all need to learn in whatever situation we are today. The first was the need for a recovery of the biblical view of truth. That Christianity, in other words, is really true. It is objectively true. It is therefore rational, like Paul says in Acts 26, "O most excellent Festus, I'm not mad. I speak words of truth and rationality." The word in the Greek is rationality. Not that it is rationalistic, as if it originates in the mind of man. Quite the contrary. It is the revealed truth of God. And let me just say in parenthesis, I'm speaking to the converted, I realize. But it's worth saying these things and remembering how important they've been. But that was the first thing, the need for the recovery of a biblical view of truth. Secondly, the need for a recovery of the biblical view of community. Now, in that moment in time, in Champéry that I'm describing, when they were going through these dark years and difficult experiences, it was somewhat inchoate. It was also not well formed, even in the beginning of Labri, once they had taken the plunge and started at Chalet Les Malaises. But let me say, and I say this with as much conviction as I'll say anything today, it was the experience of community which they were feeling after, as I say, because they were seeking for a recovery of the biblical view. It wasn't simply a fashion. It wasn't simply a fad, an idea that they had had. It was something that they saw in Scripture and were seeking to express. Not that it has to be a model in the way that they did it precisely. They would be the first to decry that view. But it was struggling for something which was very, very much within the Scriptures, and the New Testament in particular, and which they felt had been lost in their own lives to some degree, in which they were trying to recover. Now, as I look back on it, I just marvel at the relevance of this to a not only post-Christian, but a post-modern, technologically overwhelmed culture, in which community is almost completely eradicated. Right? So, although it was inchoate at the beginning and only slowly formed, and they didn't actually see how it was all going to work, because as you remember, as they started Labri, they made it very much a principle of Labri not to have a clear blueprint at the beginning, to have almost nothing like that, and the basic principles of operation, if you read them, which they wrote in July when it was formally constituted, Labri was formally constituted. They started, interestingly, and I'm sure there's relevance in this, on April the 1st. Susan went over, she must tell us the story, and there was a fog surrounding the mountains and no one had seen the view. And those of you who've seen the view will know that it is one of the most dramatic views that you'll see even in Switzerland. And she was the one who woke up in the morning, the day that they were moving over from Champery, and the mist had cleared and she was the first to see. I'm correct in this, aren't I, Susan?
Absolutely correct. I was sent over to make fires.
Yes. And so she saw this wonderful view. I've forgotten why I said that, but it doesn't matter. But the point is that the Schaeffers, they were committed to a view of following the Lord and not having a blueprint and having all the details spelled out. So when I say inchoate, unformed, the community actually slowly sort of took shape. And again, I think there's something important in that for us. Because you can make a beginning without having seen the end. You don't have to have it all clear. The Lord will show you as you go on. That was the second thing, community. The third thing was the need for a recovery of the biblical view of spirituality. Hence what I've already said. Schaeffer went back to the States, in fact made himself quite unpopular among some of the church leaders for his challenge at this point that orthodoxy was not sufficient. Because it was at a time of a split in the church, people were becoming very unkind to one another, etc. And Schaeffer was challenging the evangelical constituency from which he came and saying, listen, we must put our house in order at this point. If we are to be used by God, we have to enter into a true spirituality. Now, I've brought with me just an extract on that, which is from his book, True Spirituality. And if you read the introduction to that, you will see that he points out very carefully, describes these dark experiences that he had when he was questioning his faith, etc. And he points out that actually true spirituality is the foundation of Labri. Not that the intellectual things are unimportant, but both historically, in terms of the chronology, and in terms of the principles of God's Word, this actually is the foundation of Labri. Many people do not know that. And we are in danger of forgetting it. I mean, when I say we, internally, it has to be something which is constantly at the center of our thinking and of our praying. But in this, he says, what is central in the Christian message of good news, the evangel to the world? It centers in only one thing, the redemptive death of the Lord Jesus Christ. And he quotes Hebrews 7:27. But then he goes on and he says, now the death of the Lord Jesus is absolutely unique. It is substitutionary. There is no death like Jesus' death. There is no parallel death to Jesus' death. This must stand as absolute in our thinking. Yet, nevertheless, he goes on, we find Christ puts forth an order. In verse 22 in Luke 9:22, the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected of the elders, etc., slain and raised on the third day. There in verse 22, he puts forth an order concerning himself and his coming death. And the order is, and this was his language, his terminology, rejected, slain, raised. But this is immediately related by Jesus himself in verses 23 and 24, also to us as Christians. Rejected, slain, and raised. And then he draws that out. Then he makes this comment, and in the book the copy that he gave to each of the members of the family, because he dedicated it to his children and their spouses, he made a note in his own handwriting saying, "Please note the bottom of page 38. This is the bottom of page 38. How much thought does the necessity of death by choice provoke? How much conversation? How much prayer does this provoke for ourselves and for those we love? Is it not true that almost entirely our thoughts and our prayers for ourselves and those we love, our conversation, is aimed at getting rid of the negative at any cost, rather than praying that the negative might be faced in the proper attitude? How much prayer do we make for our children and those we love, that they may indeed be willing to walk through, by the grace of God, the steps of rejection and being slain? We are infiltrated by the world with its attitudes rather than the attitudes of the perspective of the kingdom of God. And then, of course, he very, very carefully, in his typical way, clarifies the danger of a misuse of this idea. And let me just add in parenthesis here, I'm working on a paper for Cambridge Papers at the moment, which I've entitled The Counter-Reformation of Pope John Paul II. I'll say that again very carefully. The Counter-Reformation of Pope John Paul II. One of the striking features of Paul's pontificate is the fact, remember, he became Pope in 1978. And let me quickly say, he is a remarkable man. I don't think anyone can deny that. His courage, his sincerity is almost unparalleled in the 20th century. I personally think, though, that there are some very serious mistakes that have been made at a very fundamental level, hence my paper. But the point I wanted to draw attention to, I don't want to get into this in great detail, is that seeing the great need of the Catholic Church, they have lost huge numbers, as many as we in the Protestant Church. In terms of priesthood, as you know, they've lost enormous numbers of priests. The Jesuit order, just can give you one statistic, dropped within the space of 10 years from a maximum of 36,000 to 21, just after Second Vatican. So there's been a major crisis there. But in order to renew, to regenerate the Catholic Church, one of the things that the Pope has done is to encourage the work of an organization called Opus Dei, the work of God. Started in 1921 by a man called Josemaria Escrivá, who, in my view, parallels Ignatius de Loyola in the 16th century, 1500s, started in 1540, the Society of Jesus, in terms of the genius of the conception, not the correctness of it, but the genius of the conception of the Jesuits. And Opus Dei, along with some of these other organizations, which generically the Pope refers to as the new evangelization, where they are seeing the increase of enormous numbers, are these organizations, Opus Dei and Focolare, F-O-C-O-L-A-R-E, Focolare, which just means the hearth, where the fire, the embers are, and where the fire can be lit. And the membership of Focolare is 4 million. The membership of Opus Dei is now close to 100,000. I mentioned that the Jesuits at their highest were 36,000. 100,000. Numeraries and supernumeraries. Now, you will be wondering why I'm mentioning this. The thing that is striking is that at the heart of all of these works, and in particular in relation to Focolare, which was started by a woman in Trento, just at the end of the Second World War, the famous Trent in North Italy, as the bombs were raining down, 1955, in the case of this woman, Chiara Lubich, her name is Lubich, just a handful of women at the heart of these movements, and I'm not saying that I agree with all that they're saying, you understand, but they draw attention to the same principle. In Focolare's case, exactly the same word, rejected. Jesus was rejected. Are we prepared to be rejected? Are we prepared to be slain in order to be raised? And I think why I'm mentioning this is that there is a great, not only a great need, but I think there is a realization amongst the young that if you're going to go into Christianity, it's got to be real Christianity. The younger generation is more aware than any of us, it seems to me, that the values of our society are false. That the whole basis upon which our society rests is false. And they are looking for something. Now, I'm not, please, I hope I haven't confused you. I'm not recommending these. I'm just drawing a parallel with Schaeffer, do you see? And I'm saying that there is something very, very profound in this, which you'll see evidenced in these Catholic movements, the new evangelization. Another one is the neo-catechumenate, which is very strong in this country. Now, the commanding, if you like, the framing verses with which Labri began, many people don't realize this, are the two last verses of Isaiah chapter 50. Isaiah chapter 50, verses 10. Of his servant. Let him who walks in the dark and has no light trust in the name of the Lord and rely upon his God. But now, all you who light fires and provide yourselves with flaming torches, go, walk in the light of your fires and of the torches you have set ablaze. This is what you shall receive from my hand. You will lie down in torment. I don't know a better way to describe what our contemporary Western culture has become than the lighting of fires and providing ourselves with flaming torches. We don't need God, said the Enlightenment. We can manage fine with technology and science. And look where it's brought us. You shall lie down in torment. That's the significance. Isaiah is not speaking about lighting a literal torch. Naturally, he's talking about idolatry, the leaving of the true God for idols. And hence the emphasis on fearing the Lord. Who among you fears the Lord? Who among you obeys the voice of his servant? But you see the context, and that's why the Schaeffers chose it. Walking in the dark. Now, I personally think we are walking in the dark. In terms of where we are at our moment in time, the beginning of the 21st century. And I think we need to recover these same convictions that fired the Schaeffers at the beginning. I don't think there is another way. There are no easy solutions. In the case of truth, you think of Schaeffers' personal struggles, grappling with these ideas. Is it really true? Can I open the windows? Can I open the doors and think about Christianity? In fact, now you see, we would be arguing, and have done ever since the beginning, that Christianity is gloriously true. And it is the humanist view and other religious views which are palpably false. In terms of community, of trying somehow to rediscover how to have community. But, thirdly, with the costliness of true spirituality. Not any of these three will be easy to accomplish. They will all be accompanied with the difficulty. But in relation to spirituality, what the Schaeffers were doing was turning away very specifically from technique hype, image, the big sell. I remember Schaeffer saying when he came to Cambridge at the very beginning, I suddenly realized that what I'd been involved in as an American pastor was almost equivalent to who could sell the most cornflakes. Christianity as cornflakes. I mean, you see, this is the enormous dilemma that we've got ourselves into as a church, infiltrated by the world. So speaking negatively, turning away from technique, turning away from hype, deliberately, in order to trust in the Lord and have our priorities in that, rather than lighting fires for ourselves. Positively, what Schaeffer called the moment-by-moment relationship with Christ. The moment-by-moment relationship with Christ. The centrality of prayer. And then, as I've been emphasizing, sacrifice. Now anyway, as I said, this is what I feel Labri has to offer, and this is at the end of the day the only way forward as we face the enormous and daunting challenges of living in the 21st century. I've very deliberately now singled out a few selections of eminent leaders today, Christian and non-Christians also, who are aware of just how serious the moment is in which we're living. Because when I give this talk, where have we come from, where are we going, I have to confess I do it each time with great difficulty. It is so painful, in fact, that last week Susan and I went to our local church, and I was dreading coming up here to give this lecture, as I always do, because it's painful. It's very, very painful to consider these things. It is a very dark time for the church, a very difficult time for the church. And very providentially, the minister of our little Anglican church, which we're attending, mentioned at the end a recent survey that has just come out, which indicates that between 1979 and today, there has been a drop of 1/3 in church attendance in this country. A drop of 1/3. That's Catholic, all the denominations. We can say it very simply, we were not very strong before 1979. Where are we? What are we actually facing? Now, Chuck Colson wrote a book. You know who Chuck Colson is. He's written this book on conversion, etc., and he's done a wonderful work in the formation of prison fellowship, etc., etc. He's just come out with a book dedicated to Schaeffer, incidentally, called How Now Shall We Live? And if you can get a hold of it, it's co-authored with someone who spent time in Labri in Switzerland. It's very, very fine. But his earlier book, about 10 years ago, was called Against the Night. Living, this is a subtitle, in the New Dark Ages. Carl Henry, and it would be difficult to find a less melodramatic Christian leader, wrote a book called Twilight of a Great Civilization in 1987, excuse me. And in it he says something like this: we may even now be living in the half generation before all hell breaks loose. And we will be remembered, if we are remembered at all, as those who gave their hearts and minds and very bodies to plug the dikes against impending doom. This was something which was obviously very, very clear in Schaeffer's thinking. If you've seen the opening sections of the documentary series, How Should We Then Live?, made in about that same time, late 70s, you'll see that he predicts that the West is headed for a very serious future unless something dramatic happens to intervene. The other person that I was struck by is Mary Pfeiffer, who's a bestseller in the United States, and she says this. It's called emphasizing, incidentally, the importance of community. The title is The Shelter of Each Other. In the 1930s, we had an enormous economic crisis. Today, we have the poverty of consumerism, which means never having enough. We're impoverished in a different way. We are, to quote Peter Rowan, thirsty in the rain. Many of us do work that we neither feel proud of nor enjoy. We are too rushed to do the things we really value. In the 1990s, ironies abound. With more entertainment, we are more bored. With more sexual information and stimulation, we experience less sexual pleasure. In a culture focused on feelings, people grow emotionally numb. With more time-saving devices, we have less time. With more books, we have fewer readers. With more mental health professionals, we have worse mental health. Today we're in a more elusive crisis, a crisis of meaning with emotional, spiritual and social aspects. We hunger for values, community, and something greater than ourselves to dedicate our lives to. We wake in the night, sorry for ourselves and our planet. Now all this sounds terribly gloomy, but as I say, that's why I have very deliberately selected these people whom you would not describe as melodramatic, you would not describe as scaremongers. I mean, Carl Henry, in that quotation that I mentioned, very carefully says, "For the crisis of our times, the light that shines in darkness is still more than adequate." It's not a statement of pessimism, but of realism that we are facing a dramatic moment in history as a church. So, finally, let me mention Solzhenitsyn. When Alexander Solzhenitsyn was here in London, he maintained, "Today's world has reached a stage which, if it had been described to preceding centuries, would have called forth the cry, 'This is the apocalypse.'" Now, just two final things, and then I thought I'd throw it open and say a little bit about the practical side of what Labri is and what we've been doing, just very, very briefly. And you could ask me some questions, then we can stretch our legs, then we'll head on into the subject proper. Two very important things in the light of this introduction. The first is what I call the principle of plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. The more things change, the more they remain the same. The more things change, the more they remain the same. By which I mean there isn't anything really different that we face as Christians. When you look at the New Testament, when you look at the Old Testament, you see that they faced exactly the same things. I have a wonderful article on the same sort of theme, the dilemma that we're confronting as Christians today. And the author points out that if you take any one of the single things that I've mentioned in terms of the crisis of the day, for example, pluralism, just to mention one, you'll find a parallel in the New Testament. The Greco-Roman collapse, the intellectual collapse, the formation of Stoicism, Epicureanism, etc., postmodernism. In terms of the violence, you think of Gladiator. I will not go and see it. It's been described to me, and that is sufficient. But those of you who are strong, draw the parallel. Draw the parallel. I mean, isn't this where we are today? So even though there have been these dramatic changes, and they're just terrifying in terms of their implications, this whole idea of a new world order, for example. It is the first time in history that has a practical expression. I mean, you've had global powers, but a global order is something now which is practicably possible. But within that, the Christian sees behind all of these new developments that the same reality obtains in terms of the need to trust and to obey. That him who walks in the dark and has no light, just like Paul, Just like the great saints in the Old Testament, they faced a similar sort of a situation, different in its expressions, but equally called to walk in the dark and trust God. That's the one principle. In relation to that and the theme of apocalypse, let me remind you of that wonderful apocalyptic psalm. And if there's one psalm we should be learning by heart, and I hope we are all learning the psalms by heart, people like Ridley could say the whole Psalter by heart. Psalm 46. God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble. Therefore, and when I say apocalyptic, I say this very deliberately, because obviously, as with the rest of the Old Testament, there are psalms which are to be fulfilled only at the end of the age, when Jesus returns. And this is one of them, in my view. And there's a striking parallel in Luke when he talks about the same thing here. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth give way and the mountains fall into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam and the mountains quake with their surging. You remember in Luke, Jesus says, in one of the signs at the end, there'll be signs in the sun and moon, and there'll be this roaring of the sea, tumult of the sea. There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy place where the Most High dwells. God is within her, she will not fall. God will help her at break of day. Nations are in uproar, kingdoms fall. He lifts his voice, the earth melts. Echo, Peter, the judgment, fire. The Lord Almighty is with us, the God of Jacob is our fortress. Come and see the works of the Lord, the desolations he has brought on the earth. He makes wars cease to the ends of the earth. He breaks the bow and shatters the spear. He burns the shields with fire. Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. And of course, you know what I'm leading up to saying, is that Jesus is going to come and he will be seen as the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, physically, literally, by his overthrow of all wickedness on the earth. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted, and every eye shall see him, and every knee shall bow. The Lord Almighty is with us, the God of Jacob is our fortress. So that's the first thing. There's no new reality, in a sense. We must keep all of this in perspective. The second, even more importantly, is what I call the principle of God's surprises. The principle of God's surprises. History is full of surprises, not just within Christian history, as it were, but just to take one example, if you had been with Savonarola in Florence, in the Duomo there, those of you who can picture it and think of its significance in relation to the Renaissance, and the beautiful dome that was built. Every Sunday, that building was packed, standing room only, to listen to a great reformer, Savonarola, who finally died in 1499. He was executed. Again, we're not saying he said it all right, but he knew that there had to be renewal in the Catholic Church. He longed for it. He spoke prophetically about the judgment that was coming upon Italy and the papacy, etc. If you had lived in that day as Michelangelo did, Michelangelo said he could remember Savonarola's voice till his dying day. He was a young man, he was in his teens, in his 20s, when he was listening to these sermons Sunday by Sunday. The famous Michelangelo. If you had lived in that day, would you have thought that renewal was possible? You would not. You'd have looked at the situation, you'd have said, this is just chaotic. This is worse than chaos. This is degeneration of a kind that is, irredeemable. It was only 20 years later, Luther, 95 Theses, and the whole of the Reformation burst on Europe. That's what I mean by the principle of God's surprises. You never know. During the dark experiences of the late 40s and early 50s, the Schaeffers were learning important lessons, and we must and use them from anywhere in the world, and that God will once again glorify himself through weakness. This wonderful principle, which was Oliver Cromwell's favourite text, and which he quoted as he wrote to Parliament just after the Battle of Naseby in 1645, just the very evening after the Battle of Naseby, quoting from 1 Corinthians, "For God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong." Now, those are the introductory notes, comments I just wanted to make about Labri. And just quickly to say, one of the remarkable things to us is that having such a weak base, if you like, in terms of the human resources within Labri, and Schaeffer's death, the great leader, etc., it is remarkable that we have now 7 little branches of Labri scattered around the world, and that the whole thing hasn't folded up. Remember, we make no appeals for money. That doesn't mean to say we don't have financial need, and all of Labri is not at the top range, shall we say, in terms of financial access, and yet God has kept us going through these years. And the work is very fruitful in very much the same way as it was back then. Some very outstanding people coming through, have gone on to take positions of leadership in various places. And the vast majority, just ordinary people for whom Labri was a shelter, the open house. And so it's continued. The most recent branch is out in Korea, and we've got a lovely couple out there. And they're in a section of Seoul called Hwamdong, if you're ever there. It's just not far from the station. You can go around there. And they're doing an excellent work there. He's younger. Both of them are younger. They've got 3 children. And then there's the Swedish Labri, the Dutch Labri, the original Switzerland, ourselves, and 2 in the States. Susan is going shortly to Canada, and there's a very great interest. We don't want to jump the gun on this one, but there's a very great interest in a work starting out on the west coast in Canada with a small group of people whose sons came to Labri, just as so many have done. Some of you may be feeling very lost, and who found answers, found a sense of reality. And the parents were so struck by the change in their sons' lives that they themselves came to Labri. And from that little beginning, now there is this place where they really are praying together, and they've organized this conference. So very much the principle of Labri continuing, and us seeing wonderful answers to prayer. Susan and my being in Cambridge is another aspect of that. I won't bore you with the details of that, but I would like to draw your attention to the new developments at the Round Church, if only because we ought to be praying for something like this. There are 100,000 visitors who go through that building a year. And we now have the possibility, it's not a Labri thing, but as I am representing Labri, as I am still part of Labri, we have an extraordinary possibility of influencing folk from all over the world. But anyway, there's that new development. We're just on the very verge of being able to start that. And then in a week's time, we start the 3rd of our summer schools of theology. We're trying to bring people from the States after the brain drain, people like Nigel Cameron, who went. We've just lost Kevin Van Hooser and are about to lose Carl Truman. And he's coming down for a day to give us a day's lecture during this next summer school. In fact, it's the 27th, if any of you are in the area or would like to mention it to friends. The intellectual climate of contemporary evangelical scholarship. Not a very good climate, is what he's going to be saying. The intellectual climate of contemporary evangelical scholarship. Dr. Carl Truman. So the main subject is the doctrine of Scripture, and Wayne Grudem is the main lecturer. Anyway, you'll see these things out there, which will help you bring you up to date. This is a new international brochure which tells you a little bit about each of the branches and gives their addresses. And in the Labri cassette, this is a short catalogue. There's a larger one, as you know, and then this introductory letter. Anyway, I'm keeping my eye on the clock. We'll stop in 5 or 10 minutes, if that's okay. Stretch our legs for 5 minutes and then go for an hour.